Hello and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to this special coverage hiding Ukraine-Russia conflict. The United Nations General Assembly is set to vote on United States-initiated resolution to suspend Russia from the organization's leading human rights body over allegation that its soldiers kill civilians while retreating from region around Ukraine's capital. On the other side, Russia said that the attempt to expel it from the Human Rights Council is a political act by countries that want to preserve their dominant position and control over the world. To this point, one can say, why is NATO calling Russia to stop this conflict, but at the same time still giving weapons to Ukraine? And is Russia really losing this military operation? And how could Russia survive the new sanctions? Multiple questions are directed to our panel of guests. We have Mr. Dennis Speed, writer for Executive Intelligence Review since 1993 and founding member of the Schiller Institute from New Jersey, USA, and Hussein Askaray, board member of the Belt and Road Institute in Stockholm, Sweden's capital. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us in this debate. The show begins right after this break. And before we delve into our discussion, this is the latest updates over Ukraine-Russia conflict. Kiev appeals to NATO for more weapons as the alliance meets in Brussels. Russia says it has destroyed fuel storage facilities in 4 cities as refocuses its offensive on eastern Ukraine. Moscow's troops have completed the withdrawal from around Kiev, the United States says. Ukraine's former interior minister has accused Russian snipers of shooting dead 11 civilians in the town of Hostomel near Kiev for target practice. A regional governor in eastern Ukraine has warned citizens that time is running out to flee from Russia's offensive as Moscow moves to seize control of the region. Mr. Dennis, I will be starting with you to have an idea about your interpretation to this so-called war. Is what Russia has done so far in 50 days enough to secure its national security as they claim, or is Ukraine regime still prevailing?
Well, the Ukraine regime is not prevailing, and in one sense, the Ukraine regime is itself a kind of question in this. After all, the impact on both NATO and Ukraine itself, coming from both the United States and, for that matter, intelligence agencies within the United States, as well as in Great Britain, is the primary characteristic of what you actually see. I think that Russia was in a circumstance in which the military actions that had to be taken as a result of no answer coming from, in particular, the United States, to clearly stated requests for clarity and security with respect to no NATO incursion into Ukraine, something which was essential and important for Russia's security. The fact that that was not responded to in a timely way by either NATO or the United States meant that the action would occur, because after all, there'd already been 8 years of warfare in the eastern side part of the country. I think with respect to your question as to whether or not Russia is securing its objectives, I'll put it this way. I don't believe that the conflict is really a Russia-Ukraine conflict in any sense. I believe that what's going on here is that Russia is aware that the United States, as well as the leader of the Anglosphere, the City of London, intends something far more significant. And that's what we've been seeing from particularly Foreign Minister Liz Trump of Great Britain, who stated yesterday that the intent was to actually cause a bankruptcy of Russia in the international markets. So that what is going on here is that there's a conflict called the Ukraine conflict, but that's really a proxy war which involves the attempt to subjugate not only Russia, but China also, who are seen as perhaps creating an alternative to the failed monetary system of the Anglo-American world.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Denis. Mr. Hussein, how can you see the story of Bucha massacres? And do you think this incident in particular will lead Russia-Ukraine conflict to a different path?
Potentially, yes, if the intentions are still there, as Mr. Denis Speed says, to escalate the conflict. Remember that the day before this news came out on the massacre, there was a major breakthrough actually in the negotiations for a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. These negotiations, they don't really feature in the news program, especially in Europe and in the United States. They were very close to certain breakthroughs. The Russian and Ukrainian negotiators first in Turkey and then online. And actually, they were discussing the final wording of the statements which will be, or whatever will be signed by President Putin and President Zelensky. That was something which should have been the biggest and most important news. Suddenly, the day after, you have the news of this unverified massacre taking place. And we have, unfortunately, seen similar things happen where military intelligence agencies, they create these things like we saw in Syria with chemical attacks. These were military intelligence agencies working with media like Al Jazeera TV and others to, implicate creating a fake story of a chemical attack where they show children, and the woman and covered in dust. And then they say Bashar Assad and the Russians bombed this place with chemical weapons. And then immediately the reaction is already measured on the other side to attack Syria or to give more support to the opposition or to stop the peace negotiations which were going on actually between the Syrian government and the opposition. So these are classical, probably black operations. We don't know. We need to have a verification of these incidents before. But the fact that everybody jumped to the conclusion that the Russians were culprits before anybody could do a real investigation, this shows that what the intention behind this was. So I think people should go back to the negotiations table. There is no other solution than a peaceful diplomatic resolution of this conflict.
Perfectly understood. All right, moving on now to the second point of our discussion. The United States imposed new economic sanctions Wednesday on Russia, targeting Russian banks, as well as President Vladimir Putin's two adult daughters, in response to atrocities in Ukraine that the White House called war crimes. Let's follow this report.
President Joe Biden's administration imposed sweeping new economic sanctions against major Russian banks, as prevailing and Alpha Bank, including banning Americans from investing in Russia, in order to increase economic pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin.
There's nothing less happening than major war crimes. Responsible nations have to come together to hold these perpetrators accountable.
During his speech at the Legislative Conference of North America's Building Trade Unions in Washington, U.S. President Joe Biden denounced major war crimes by referring to the bodies left in the streets after the withdrawal of Russians and the civilians executed in cold blood in Bucha, near Kiev.
And we're taking additional steps in lockstep with our allies and partners to raise the economic pressure on Putin. First, the United States will impose full blocking sanctions on Sberbank, by far the largest financial institution in Russia, and Alpha Bank, its largest private bank.
The list of sanctions against Russia included as well Putin's two daughters. White House spokesperson Jen Psaki announced the sanctions during her press briefing in Washington.
Well, we've seen a pattern over time of President Putin and Russian oligarchs stash assets and resources in the bank accounts and of their family members. And so this was an effort to get at those assets, and that's why these individuals were sanctioned.
U.S. authorities explained the reason behind targeting Putin's daughters with sanctions, claiming they could be in control of some of their father's assets.
Mr. Denis, based on this report, why are the US probably the only country, and to some extent also UK, putting these severe sanctions over Russia? Though the US is totally in a different continent, why they are doing their best to damage the Russian economy?
There's been a recent discussion that has surfaced, particularly in certain media in Britain, Great Britain television, some others, with some historians there who are talking about what they call the Anglosphere. This is a way of referring to the idea of North America and also Great Britain as representing this sphere. You've also probably heard the term global Britain. Now, what's going on is that the monetary system that is represented by this Anglosphere is actually bankrupt and is looking in a predatory way to essentially loot. Now, remember that Russia already was looted once between 1991 and 1999. Then Vladimir Putin came to power. He reversed that. And it's amusing to hear the oligarchs put together with Putin when, in fact, Putin was the one that went to war against the oligarchs. And he referred to himself, that is, Vladimir Putin referred to himself in 2007 as attempting to do what President Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the United States did. Now, here's the irony. The United States and Britain have expropriated $350 billion from Russia. In other words, they've seized communist style, a large portion of Russia's assets. And then they talk about Russia going into default. No, the reason for the specific sanctions that you just cited is simply vindictive and predatory. And it shows actually the weakness and cowardice of not only the person, but the entities that are attempting to perpetrate this. It won't work. It will actually lead to a greater deprivation for Europe in particular, which is going to suffer, and for the world as a whole, particularly when you look at things like food and the inability of people to buy that on the international exchange.
So, Dennis, I'm sorry to cut your train of thought, but it is said that the list of sanctions has been already prepared before the military operation has been launched. Do you agree with that?
Not only that, what I would say that it's no different than the military operation. It's part of the military operation. It's actually more essential, and more people, by the way, will die as a result of the sanctions policy than the military operations themselves.
Understood. Mr. Hussein, we all know that Russia is a very rich country in all fields, especially with natural resources hereby. Do you think that the sanctions imposed so far will put an end to its existence as one of the world leaders and will stop this operation in Ukraine?
No, I don't think it will stop the operation in Ukraine. I think what the Europe specifically is doing, the EU specifically, it's a suicidal policy, imposing sanctions on Russia at the time when Europe is very much reliant on Russian gas and oil. I think this is a bit of a suicidal policy. And at the same time, they are pushing to prolong the war. So this is a very, very weird situation where on the one hand, they want Russia to continue to ship or to send the gas by pipelines to Europe so the factories can continue to run where you can have heat and light in the homes. But at the same time, they want to continue to increase these. I think this is a very counterproductive policy. What should replace it, as I said, the EU should support the negotiations. They should establish a better economic relation with Russia. People in the United States and Europe for a long time, they were saying that Russia is a second-rate power. It's only reliant on oil and gas exports. It has no economy. That's not true. There is a chicken game going on because people hope that the Russian economy will collapse. It will not. Russia, under Putin in recent years, has developed, first of all, its agriculture. It's not only self-reliant in agricultural products, but it's exporting wheat to the rest of the world. It has built an industrial capacity where Russia is exporting fertilizers to many countries in the world. Many countries in the world, and this is the basis for the food prices also Mr. Speed is talking about, is Russia is actually a major exporter of fertilizers. So the Russians have much more options to diversify their export markets than the EU has to import its energy, which is reliant on Russia for about 40% for natural gas and 30% for oil. Most cars here in Sweden run on Russian oil. So if that stops, we will have a terrible economic disaster.
Perfectly understood. Clear enough. Thank you. All right, moving on now. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has denounced the pressure exerted against the Russian giant Gazprom in Europe, stressing that nationalizing Russian assets is a double-edged sword.
Повторю, ситуация здесь в энергетической сфере The situation in the energy sector is worsening as a result of non-market, brute measures, including administrative pressure on our company Gazprom in some European countries. We are already hearing statements from official figures about the nationalization of some of our assets. We can go far like that. Let no one forget that this is a double-edged sword.
Mr. Dennis, coming back to USA last week, based on Biden's words, US President, they are using the oil reserve to overcome the petroleum dilemma nowadays. So can we say if this conflict lasts longer, and no one hopes so, but if it lasts longer, do you think this conflict will damage US resource of oil and gas and the energy sector in general?
Well, that's a complex question because, in fact, the United States has extensive capabilities. However, what is the case is that this is going to be prolonged. What's actually happening here is there's a reset going on, a sort of global reset, in which particularly the oil industry, coal, natural gas, these things are being dismantled in the transatlantic world. The idea is to use this as the forward base to try to pressure Russia to break with China, which will never occur. It's just not going to occur because they're aware of what the nature of this is. An existential attack on the Russian state. And therefore, the Russian state must respond. But more importantly, and what I'm trying to work to do, particularly those of us who are involved here in the United States, is to make people aware that the prices of gas, the prices of food, the prices of various commodities are not being affected by anything having to do with the Ukraine circumstance, but rather the Ukraine circumstance is being used as the pretext to, in fact, try to loot the world, resubjugating the world in a colonial style, right, by various measures that can be taken through monetary capabilities that are in existence.
Mm-hmm. Understood. Mr. Hussein, Europe in general, and particularly the unfriendly countries of Moscow, are looking forward to replace Russian gas with US and Qatari ones. The main question now, could the US and Qatar replace the Russian energy products?
No, the simple answer is no, not now, not in the future, because there are certain physical, economic things which people don't think about when it comes to these questions. There's a wishful thinking that the United States and Qatar will replace Russia in terms of the imports. Russia exports around 155 billion cubic meters of natural gas to Europe, mostly through pipelines. Now, pipelines are more efficient and carry much more volume of natural gas than ships do with liquefied natural gas, which also costs very much. If you look at the United States exports to the world and Qatar's exports to the world, which is much less than what Russia is exporting to Europe, most of it goes actually not to Europe. It goes to Japan, Korea, China, India. So even if Qatar and the United States decide to throw all those countries who are their friends and trade partners under the bus, even that would not help. Of course, that's an impossibility. The United States' major export market is not Europe. It is Mexico, number one. It exports almost 39% of its natural gas to Mexico and about 20% of its natural gas to Canada by pipelines. The rest it exports as liquefied natural gas to other countries. Now, if you cut the gas to Mexico, for example, and you have a total nightmare in Mexico, imagine how many millions of refugees you will have, coming to the United States. This is not the right policy. It's not economical. It's not scientific. It's not morally fit. So I don't think Qatar and the United States will take the decision to throw Japan, South Korea, India, and other countries whom they consider their allies under the bus for the sake of saving this situation. All other alternatives are long-term alternatives. They will not help. The solution today is, as I said, go back to the negotiations. Europe should support the negotiations. The trade and economic cooperation with Russia should continue. We have something called the Belt and Road Initiative, which Europe is actually very much dependent on. We had, since the start of the conflict, most of the rail freight, which is very crucial for European industries and also for exporting to China, these railways have been blocked, not by physical damage, but by the EU sanctions and the refusal of EU of using the Belarus and Russian railway networks, which are the only way to go to China.
Perfectly.
So I think a solution should include to integrate Ukraine itself into the Belt and Road Initiative, making Ukraine a bridge between Asia, Southwest Asia, West Asia, and Europe, instead of Ukraine becoming a wall, a new Berlin Wall, to block cooperation between East and West. Europe should wake up today. We will have a major economic disaster. We are already witnessing the effects of it, but politicians are telling the people, you have to endure the difficulties because we are fighting for freedom, and so on and so forth. This is not going to work. We will have a massive economic depression in Europe, which will affect the whole world.
Quite understood. Mr. Dennis, do you agree with Mr. Hussein saying that US and Qatar, we never have the chance to replace Russian gas?
I think more than simply agree, I'd like to just point something out. What's happening to the United States is woeful because actually the United States is one sense as much of a target, particularly the American population. You have to go to new kinds of technologies. And what's happened with the Belt and Road Initiative is that countries like China and Russia have proposed that the United States be integrated as well into not something which is either unipolar or multipolar. And oil, coal, natural gas, and so on, these are fossil fuels. There's going to be a succession to nuclear power, nuclear fusion, perhaps, and other technologies. The U.S. used to be a leader in technologies, and it used to collaborate with nations. That's what people are asking for. Matter of fact, we have to sort of return to the idea of a kind of a unified treaty. We call it the Treaty of Westphalia approach, where if you think somebody is an enemy of yours, negotiate on the basis of science, technology, the mutual interest, material and social interests of everybody. Now, that's what has to happen. The geopolitics is dead. And the United States and England, which has sort of captured it imperially, they've got to learn that. So not only do I agree, I would reemphasize this is a moment of transition in the world. What has been said in the memorandum of agreements between Russia and China from February 4th is right. This does not hurt the United States. It would be great for the American people and for people all over the world.
Perfectly understood. It is worth mentioning that to be noticed that this graphic shown over the screen back to Mr. Michele Guerrecci, who is a former Undersecretary of State in the Italian Ministry of Economy. Now moving on, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ramtana Mamra, continued his tour aimed at settling the conflict in Ukraine. The head of the Algerian diplomacy met Friday, April 5th, with his Ukrainian counterpart, Dmytro Kuleba. The meeting was held in presence of foreign ministers of Jordan, Iraq, Sudan, Egypt, and the General Secretary of the Arab League.
We are tremendously concerned by the crisis and extremely worried by its implications at all levels, notably by its humanitarian consequences and the threats that it implies on the global peace and security landscape. We are here out of our firm conviction that we cannot remain indifferent to a major international crisis and opposing two friendly countries. We are here because we firmly believe in the virtues of diplomacy and dialogue to achieve peaceful and political solutions to problems, no matter how difficult or complicated they are.
Mr. Hussein, it's quite clear that diplomacy failed by the West and European countries in general. But what about the Arab intervention? And how can you read Blinken's visit last week to the MENA region?
Well, there's a new, diplomacy should continue. Military solutions are not solutions. It will lead us to world war. We should continue the diplomatic mission, as the Foreign Minister of Algeria is saying. But there is, people don't really understand that many countries, most countries in the so-called Middle East, in West Asia, in Asia, even India, and other countries which the West was relying on, are not going along with the Western anti-Russian position. We saw what happened with the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, The ambassadors of the EU told him he should, distance himself from Russia, and he screamed at them and said, "Look, do you look at us as slaves? We are not your slaves. We are independent nations. We decide which policy we follow. You don't dictate to us." This is the situation in most countries in the Arab world. I mean, you saw that the Saudi Arabian crown prince and one of UAE, they refused to take a call from Biden because they knew he wanted them to cut ties with Russia. The Arab countries, especially the oil exporting countries, have very important agreements with Russia on oil exports. It's called the OPEC Plus, and they also have strategic interests. They don't want to sabotage because of listening to this insane military policy. Iran, on the other hand, is also. So we have a new constellation of forces in the world where you have a Eurasian, the Russia working with China, with the Belt and Road nations, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, with the BRICS, and so on and so forth. The risk is that we will have a divided world. What we need today is we don't need a new Cold War. We don't need a new divided world because the world economy is nations are reliant on each other. And therefore, diplomacy and a new architecture, and I think your guest, Mr. Dennis Speed, has something to say about the conference, which I actually registered to attend, which the Schiller Institute is organizing, on how to build a new international economic and political and security architecture in the world. This is what is needed today, not more military aid and military interventions.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Dennis, a week ago, Antony Blinken paid a visit to Algeria within his tour over the Middle East and North African countries. And yesterday, Arab ministers, not just yesterday, but the last week, ministers led by the Algerian Foreign Minister, Mr. Mtalla Mamra, flew over to Russia and Ukraine to find a common ground between the two countries. So, what role can the Arab leaders play to end this conflict?
Well, as was just indicated, in the United States, what we're trying to do is to pull together some sort of way for the Americans to think about the world again. And one of the reasons that this is so important, coming back to the specific thing you asked me, is think about the old days of the non-aligned movement, the days when you had this conception that there was going to be a development from poverty into prosperity, and that different sectors of the world would lead that. Now, if you look at what has happened to Iran, Iraq, and Pakistan, and Afghanistan, with respect to American involvement in those areas. American involvement, and yes, there's British financial involvement, but it's American. What has happened? These were transitional nations in all cases. And of course, with the case of Iran, you go back to 1953 with the CIA's involvement there. Iraq, we know very well. Afghanistan, the United States has been there for 20 years. Now look at what has just happened with Pakistan. But the thing that distinguishes all those nations is that they are what you might have called transitional nations. Nations which, by the way, saw nuclear technology as a stepping stone, as an essential stepping stone from poverty to prosperity, scientifically allowing them to free themselves from the dominance of fossil fuels or other sorts of limitations. And what happened was that they were pounded back. They were pounded back into underdevelopment. That was the concept, at least. Well, it hasn't happened with Pakistan, but it has been, and it hasn't quite happened with Iran either. But it's obvious. Now, why is this significant in terms of this issue of the Islamic world? Today, it's a case, as in one sense it was even at the time of the Bandung conference, that this represents a capability to come in as a kind of a mediating capability in one sense. But if you define it from the standpoint of the notion that the most advanced technologies in science, the research and development must be the actual commonwealth of all people. This is something that is very much at the core of the Belt and Road Initiative, something which, by the way, the mentor of our magazine, the creator, Lyndon LaRouche, the late Lyndon LaRouche, very much insisted on. That's an American perspective. It used to be an American perspective, as Vladimir Putin has, in fact, insisted when he talks about Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Perfect.
We're having a conference that's happening this Saturday. That's right. I'm going to be involved with that. And it's Schiller Institute Conference. And the idea is a new defense, security, and development architecture for all nations. And that's the perspective I believe the United States has got to adopt.
Thank you, Mr. Dennis. We have reached the limited time for our show. Mr. Hussein, Mr. Dennis, thank you so much for your presence with us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. If the military operation continue tomorrow. We will hold the 51st special coverage. Bye bye for now.